Call the Senate to order. For those of you who've been here before, you know I can't resist doing that. So good evening to all of you, and welcome to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. I'm Adam Hines, the CEO of the Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all here this evening, all of you who are in our one-to-one exact replica of the U.S. Senate, and all of you coming to us online. One of the viewers online is former U.S. Senator from California, Barbara Boxer. So she's a board member here at the Institute, and we're just so glad that you could join us, Senator. No zinger questions for Senator Merkley. She'll have good company online. As you may notice, the Senator is not here today because of changes in plans in the U.S. Senate. He's the Senate is running late due to votes, and so the Senator had to stay in Washington for those, and he'll join us virtually instead on the screen behind me, as you'll see in a moment. His longtime former Chief of Staff, Mike Seymour, is with us in person, and we'll hear some real insights into their book that's recently been released called Filibuster, How to Fix the Broken Senate and Save America. And it's an interesting time for them to be with us because this is the first event on the book since recent leadership and retirement announcements in the Senate. So we look forward to that in a moment. First of all, a special thank you to our members who are here with us tonight. Your support enables us to provide hands-on educational experiences to students across the Commonwealth and the country, and it allows us to conduct programs like this evening's discussion. I want to say this about the Institute. Since its founding, we've been a powerful voice for participatory democracy and civil discourse in our country. And during this academic year alone, more than 20,000 students will come through these doors and step into the role of senators for a day, working with fellow student senators across the aisle in this chamber to pass substantial legislation on everything from climate change to immigration. And I'll say, in recent years, the Institute has expanded its mission to work on directly strengthening our democracy, a particular focus on the Senate, of course, being an institution that Senator Kennedy loved so deeply. And tonight is an example of how our public events will focus more and more on the national leaders who are at the center of conversations and efforts to modernize our governing institutions. It's a vital effort, and it deserves to be normalized and lifted up. So thanks again to the Senator and Mike. It is with that mission in mind that we are hosting this conversation with folks who are working incredibly hard behind the scenes and in the public eye to make sure our democratic institutions are living up to their original intent. Senator Jeff Merkley is the son of a millwright and the first in his family to attend college. I appreciate that his path to the U.S. Senate went through the state legislature, where he was a speaker. And he has represented Oregon in the U.S. Senate since 2009. He has been a true leader in the effort to strengthen our democracy and is a strong advocate in tackling inequality and climate change. So thank you, Senator, for joining us tonight. I understand you may not be able to hear me, but you will be able to hear them, and that's what's important. Mike Seymour served as Senator Merkley's longtime chief of staff. He worked with the Senator on their efforts to reform the Senate's filibuster rules, which made him a leading and recognized expert on Senate procedure. Mike is now an adjunct faculty member at American University in the Washington College of Law and the National Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the ACLU. And they will be in conversation with Abdullah Fayyad, who is a policy correspondent at Vox. He previously worked at The Atlantic and the Boston Globe, where he served on the editorial board. In 2022, impressively, he was named a Pulitzer Prize finalist for a series he wrote on reforming the American presidency. So welcome to you all again, and over to you, Abdullah.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that kind introduction, Adam. And thank you, Senator Merkley, for joining us. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. And thanks, everybody, for coming here tonight. This is going to be a good conversation. I know that Senate rules aren't necessarily all that riveting, or at least they're not supposed to be, but you know that there's something wrong with the Senate when this many people show up to talk about a Senate bill. So thanks, everybody, for coming. So to start off,
You know, this is clearly a serious problem. One of the reasons I know that is because your book title has an exclamation point in it, so it's already yelling at me. Senator Merkley, let me start with you. Why don't you just outline for us quickly why the filibuster, of all Senate rules, is something that warrants this much attention?
Absolutely, Abdullah. It's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. And the challenge is this, that the filibuster, which really what this means, is not continuous speaking in any form. What it means is that to close debate, you have to have 60 votes, which means 41 votes can prevent the Senate from ever actually getting a bill to the floor or ever actually closing debate. In other words, it can act as a veto. So you have a 41 vote veto. It takes no effort, no time, no public visibility, and it's an excellent tool with which the minority can paralyze any action by the majority. So in that case, take that power and then sync that with the current tribalism between the parties, and the minority party is very tempted to use this as an instrument of legislative destruction to prevent bills from ever getting the possibility of a vote. And that interrupts the whole cycle of democracy in which you elect people who have a vision that you share. They take a majority, you expect them to pass the laws, but they don't. And so the Senate becomes paralyzed, and in the course really generates, instead of solutions, generates cynicism, generates frustration among the population, and fails to address the issues that we have to address in a rapidly evolving world.
So one of the problems clearly is that the filibuster is overused, to put it mildly. But Mike, we were talking about this earlier. One of the things that you pointed out that I think is interesting is how common it is to use the filibuster today versus past eras. Can you talk a little bit about how senators are misusing the filibuster today? How often they're using it today compared to previous times?
Sure thing. And before I answer that, I just want to say thank you to Adam and the Institute for hosting us. It is a privilege to be in this beautiful space and to be sitting on the Senate floor without having to wear a tie for the first time in my life. Really appreciate that. So the filibuster evolved, and we can talk more about the history later, but the filibuster evolved as a very occasional tool of the minority when they felt very, very passionately about an issue. Sadly, shamefully, usually the issue they usually cared about was enforcing legal discrimination or buttressing slavery. But it was rarely invoked. In fact, in the height of the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1964, there were 9 filibusters in the U.S. Senate. Today we have a totally different Senate. So in the 6 years that Mitch McConnell was the minority leader and Barack Obama was president, there were 643 filibusters. 9 to 643. It's a difference of kind, not just degree. The Senate today is an absolutely different institution, and as Senator Merkley was describing, we have reached a place where it is a de facto supermajority requirement to pass virtually anything, and that has really broken the entire kind of operating system that the Senate was built on.
So, Senator, you've both worked on this for a long time. But I wanted to ask you, what has been the biggest roadblock in your view to actually reforming the filibuster to improve the Senate's responsiveness to society's needs?
Well, the biggest roadblock has been that the two parties experience this obstruction in a different way. The Republican Party created a filibuster-free pathway for tax legislation, so they can do deductions and they can do credits by simple majority. It's called reconciliation. They did that by a nuclear option in 1996. So if you take the perspective of Mitch McConnell, this is a heads he wins. He's the head of the Republican caucus in the Senate. It's a heads he wins, tails Democrats lose, because he can pursue the nominations and he can pursue all kinds of policies through the tax legislation by simple majority. But then if he's in the minority, he can block the very wonky policy provisions. You know, Democrats tend to say, hey, here's a better policy for health care, for housing, for education, for labor rights, for the environment, for civil rights, and he can block all of those. So each time we have a significant reform coalition and they go to Mitch McConnell says, stop it. I like the Senate the way it is. We have the best path when we're in the majority, and we have the best path when we're in the minority. Why would we want to level the playing field by reforming the Senate? So that has been the biggest obstacle.
In the last 3 years or so, was one of the biggest obstacles a duo that rhymes with Sanchin and Minima?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that, so I'll pass that.
That's fine. I'll give you a pass there. But I think, you know, one of the interesting things about what you say there is that, you know, Republicans in the Senate did face considerable pressure from Trump early in his presidency to scrap the filibuster. You know, how did they hold firm then when there was pressure from, you know, the leader of their party that they have such a hard time saying no to usually?
Yes, absolutely. Trump was ranting on social media saying, get rid of the filibuster, we can get everything done we want. But what Trump didn't understand is what I just described, that from the Republicans' perspective, when they were in the majority, they had all the tools they needed. They could do their tax reform, they could do nominations by simple majority, they could do congressional review acts by simple majority. They understood that the Senate worked very well for the Republicans in its current form. Trump simply did not understand that.
You know, Mike, one of the things that strikes me as kind of a roadblock here is that the filibuster is very appealing for any person in the minority, including if you're a Democrat. And I think, you know, when you're looking forward to post 2024, you know, in the outcome where Trump wins the presidency, Republicans have a good chance at regaining the Senate. You know, things that are on the table are issues that really matter to a lot of Democratic voters. Everybody in the country, chief among them, abortion rights, are going to come up, and there's going to be a lot of pressure for Republicans to pass something on abortion. Without a filibuster, Democrats would have little recourse to stop them from passing legislation. So, you know, what would you say to skeptics on your side of the aisle in the Senate, you know, who are currently thinking about filibuster reform? Why should they do it now when there's so much at stake coming up in the next cycle?
So there are many things, as you've described, that all of us would like to prevent happening if we were not in the majority in the Senate. And having the filibuster as a tool in those instances is reassuring. I think what people lose sight of is that, first of all, for Democrats, we're losing in slow motion. Because of the dynamic that Senator Merkley described, we now are working on 15 years of having most of the policies that Democrats promise when they run for office being left on the table, not delivering what Democrats say they're going to do for the American people. And that breeds cynicism, it breeds contempt almost, and you see it in the polls, right? The way people think about Congress. When they see over and over again all the things that people want, whether it's, you know, abortion protections or gun safety legislation or addressing the climate crisis or raising, you know, raising environmental standards and protections, or, you know, a whole host of other things. The repeated failure to deliver is you know, kind of an unexplainable kind of consequence of our dysfunction that, you know, is otherwise the only alternative that people can conceive of is that Congress doesn't work, that the system doesn't work, or that the members themselves are like corrupt and in the bag, and it's like they're all on the take from somebody else. They're working for somebody else. All of that is incredibly corrosive to Democrats specifically, because Democrats are the party of government, and if you want people to believe in government and vote for your party and your vision, then they have to believe the government's actually capable of delivering. But it's also incredibly corrosive to small d Democrats, like anybody who believes in the idea of democracy. The senator talked about this broken feedback loop where the public does not get what they vote for time after time, and so the accountability isn't really with the majority; it's with the minority, and but people don't see that. And so, if we continually corrode this belief that government is capable of working, that Congress is capable of delivering, that the representatives who are in Washington, D.C. are actually working for the people who elect them, then we wind up where we are today, right? In a situation that's very vulnerable to demagoguery, where people have lost their faith in the idea of our constitutional vision, and people are susceptible to arguments that we just need someone who's strong and won't put up with any of the BS and will get cut to the chase and get things done and break the rules, because the rules are obviously working for somebody else and not for all of us.
And Abdullah, can I add on to that a little bit?
Please do.
Because in part your question poses, why would Democrats give up the ability to restrict or obstruct the Republicans when they're in the minority? And the vision that Mike and I have laid out in this book is not one of getting rid of the filibuster. It's one of going to a talking filibuster. And what that means is that if the minority opposes a bill, they can delay it, and they can delay it by holding the floor continuously. But this does two things we don't have now. One, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a huge amount of effort if you're going to go through the night or through the weekend or through the week. The second of all, it puts the debate squarely in front of the American people. So now the citizens can weigh in. Are you a hero or are you a bum? And we're confident that on a number of policies that we would like to stop, the American people are with us. The American people want a gun registration system that works well, but we don't have it because of the filibuster. They want freedom of choice, but we aren't able to pass a freedom of choice bill because of the filibuster. They want us, yeah.
On that issue in particular, I mean, one part of history they mentioned in the book is the Sandy Hook massacre, and how hard it was for, after, such a tragic kind of event that shocked the nation, consumed the Obama administration in their second term. It was still so hard to actually get anything done, and it was impossible to get anything done on gun reform, despite this public outcry and movement behind it, and polls largely indicating Americans by and large support basic reforms. Can you talk a little bit about that moment in Senate history, and what exactly stopped the Senate from passing gun reform?
Well, I can tell you, we tell the story of Nicole Hockley, whose son Dylan was killed at Sandy Hook, and how she came and watched the Senate, and she and others worked so hard to bring their stories and their desire for a good gun safety bill, and that it was narrowed down to basically background checks, but even that failed the 60-vote test. And why did it fail? Well, because you have, this involves some other factors, but you have one party that gives great deference to the National Rifle Association. There's a lot of single issue voters. They bring a lot of monies into campaigns, and the people's voice, therefore, even when 80% of Democrats, Republicans, Independents support a good background check system, it doesn't get through the lobby and the money that come to bear on the Senate. But it's a great example of how we would have passed a bill. And this was sponsored by a pro-gun Democrat, Senator Manchin, a pro-gun Republican, and we still couldn't get it done. But at a simple majority, we would have passed it. It would have been popular. And it's a great example of how the debate would have been in front of the American people, and the American people would have weighed in and helped us carry the day.
So I do want to take a step back to talk about what you were just saying earlier about, you're not here talking about abolishing the filibuster altogether, but reforming it so you can still get legislation passed while having the minority be heard if they want to be heard. And I think that's a really delicate balance in any democracy, is to what degree should the minority be heard, and how much power should the minority have? You know, and so Mike, can you walk us back a little bit and you know, tell people who might think the filibuster is part of, you know, the Senate from its founding, you know, why there's this, and a big part of your book is myth busting, you know, kind of showing these falsehoods about the filibuster and, you know, whether or not it was something the founders intended for the Senate. Can you tell us a little bit about the history and you know, where the current filibuster came from?
Sure. So when the first Senate met in 1789, the founders were in the room, right? Like these are the people who wrote the Constitution. So a lot of them were in the Revolution. Some of them signed the Declaration of Independence. They came there to Philadelphia. They wrote the Constitution for the purpose of creating a federal government that could get things done. And so the rules of the Senate, contrary to a very prevalent myth that even some senators profess to believe, is that, you know, that this whole 60-vote supermajority, you know, kind of construct was handed down from Mount Sinai. No, in fact, the first senators who were in the room came there knowing that their role was to debate and to vote by simple majority to pass stuff. And we know that because the very first rules of the Senate that adopted Jefferson's manual that said nobody can speak tediously or beside the point superfluously. And in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton talked about supermajorities creating contemptible compromise and of the compromise of the common good. And so they came there planning to vote. And in fact, they did vote, but there were 26 of them. It's a small group of people. And they quickly sort of developed what we call the code of, you know, it's kind of a social contract that said, look, we'll hear everybody. Everybody gets to say their piece. You can offer amendments, and then we'll vote on the amendment, and then someone else will offer an amendment, and we'll vote on the amendment, and we'll have a robust debate, and then we'll have the final vote. And that was the operating system of the Senate that really emerged. And what it entailed was that every senator, regardless of party, has a chance to influence the legislation. They don't have a right to block their legislation. They don't have a right to pass their amendments or pass their bills. But they do have the ability to get issues onto the floor, to get their colleagues to talk about them and to vote on them. And ultimately, when everyone's had a reasonable chance to do that, the Senate would do as was intended by the Constitution, have a vote on the bill. And it would be a simple up or down vote, which, as all of us know and all the children on the playground know, is like the fair way of deciding what should prevail. And the filibuster, you know, only emerged half a century into the Senate's existence as a very, as I said earlier, very uncommon exception and really a violation of the norms to abuse the rules and hijack the Senate. So, but that code of conduct really held all the way into the 1990s before it kind of succumbed to what we now have today.
Well, on the issue of the code, there's a part of the book that I want to read, and I hope that Alexander Hamilton's descendants are not in this room with us, because you both write, while Alexander Hamilton and his family would surely disagree, Hamilton may not have been Aaron Burr's most consequential killing. Senator, what was Aaron Burr's most consequential killing?
So there was a rule in the original Senate rules called the previous question. And it was a rule that allowed you to say, we've had enough debate, let's vote. This particular rule was virtually never used because of the Senate code that Michael was just talking about. You look around the room, has everyone had their say? Fine, we're going to vote. So Aaron Burr, as he's sitting there as vice president and pondering things, because at that point the vice president did preside over the Senate, thought, well, this rule really isn't used much, so we don't need it anymore. And plus, the Senate had other measures to control the debate. They had Jefferson's manual. They had Jefferson, who had served in presiding over the Senate as vice president. They had the clear recognition that the presiding officer in the Senate could call the Senate to order. So they had all these factors in which, so this rule didn't seem necessary. Well, out it goes. And then later on, when you have the battles between the North and the South, which led to those first filibusters, it was over a national bank bill that the South thought would hurt the slave economy in the South and would strengthen the manufacturing economy of the North. They said, well, we had this idea that we could nullify federal laws we didn't like at the state level. And President Jackson said, no, hell no. So that killed nullification. So, how do you stop a civil rights bill or a bill that would hurt the slave economy of the South? You talk it to death. And at that point, if the previous question had still been there would have been an easy answer to this tool of obstruction. But without it, you didn't have such a clear and easy tool to stop the talking the bill to death.
Well, there was a time when former President Obama had called the filibuster a Jim Crow relic. Can you talk a little bit more about how it has been used in the past to suppress civil rights, both especially as Jim Crow went on and in the lead up to the civil rights era as well?
Yeah, so you saw that initial filibuster in 1841 was a battle between the North and the South. Well, then you have the Civil War, and you have Reconstruction, and then you have the loss of Reconstruction, and folks say, hey, let's restore the element of Reconstruction that protected voting rights in the South, voting registration and the ballot and accounting. And this was a battle in which that bill was killed by the filibuster, and it became one civil rights effort after another that was killed by the filibuster led by Southern Democrats. They had lost political power during Reconstruction. You had 2 black Southerners elected to the U.S. Senate or sent to the U.S. Senate by their state legislatures. You had some 14 House members. You had hundreds of state legislators, black Americans, in the South. All of that was disappeared almost overnight when Reconstruction ended. The effort to restore civil rights, the Southern white establishment was determined to stop that, and they used the filibuster to do it. And that's virtually the only issue that was blocked in this fashion. It was called a filibuster because filibuster is a word that means kind of freebooter, which is a word for piracy. So it was pirates taking over the Senate to stop civil rights bills, and that's why it was a Jim Crow relic in Obama's words.
One more question for you, Senator. You started in the Senate as an intern. That was your first job in Congress. When did you notice that the filibuster was going to be one of your principal fights when you get elected to the Senate?
It was January 2009 when I came to the Senate. That summer of 1976, so 48 years ago, when I was an intern, I worked on the Tax Reform Act of that summer, and I was covering the floor debate for Senator Hatfield. There was no television on the floor. There was no fax machine. There was no cell. So a senator would meet with a staff member to say, what was the debate on that previous amendment? What are folks back home saying about it? And then they'd go in and vote. So I'd run down from the staff gallery to meet Hatfield and brief him. He'd go in and vote. And that bill had 125 votes. Not a single one of them was a supermajority. Not a supermajority to get to the floor, not a supermajority to close debate on amendment, close debate on the final bill. Always it followed the Senate code. I was totally, and then I saw the Senate in the 1980s when I worked for the Senate. The filibuster was still much more restricted. When I came back in January of 2009, I was just shocked. I had heard that the minority party, which was the Republican Party, had started to use it to bring the Senate operations to a halt. It had spread from final passage of bills to nominations. It had spread to motions to proceed to the floor, and it had spread to amendments. And so it had become dominating in a way that made 100 capable, intelligent people just waste their time day and night. I was shocked. January 2009.
Well, now here you are, having written a book about it, so hopefully some change will come soon. Mike, I wanted to talk to you about kind of, what the filibuster does to our democracy now. Oftentimes Americans will yearn for multi-party parliamentary systems because they're like, oh, look how efficient those are. Look, they pass laws so quickly, and here we are in the U.S. It takes us decades to actually pass some climate legislation, basic climate legislation, and oftentimes it feels like it's too little, too late. But filibuster defenders say, well, that's the beauty of the Senate. It's as you were talking earlier, it pushes compromise. Does the filibuster actually encourage compromise, or does it just shut down debate entirely?
Well, there's been over 1,000 filibusters in the last decade. Do people feel like compromise is breaking out all over the place? I mean, I think the record sort of stands for itself, or speaks for itself. There is a sort of facile logic to the idea that if you need 60 votes in the Senate and there are fewer than 60 of one party, and that it's going to require bipartisanship and therefore compromise. And so the filibuster is an engine of compromise. The reality is that is only true if both parties have an incentive to produce a bill. And in the hyper-partisan politics of our current moment, we rarely are in that position. So most of the legislating now is what I would consider sort of emergency legislating, right? Like there's a deadline that Congress creates for itself, or there's some kind of external emergency that needs to be responded to. And aside from those, handful of big emergency bills, very little actually happens. And so you end up with a lot of other stuff, being rolled into those bills. Things happen in closed doors behind, in the dark of night without a lot of illumination or understanding by even the members themselves what they're voting on. And we're empowering the lobbyists. We're sort of decreasing visibility and accountability to the voters. And all of that is because the incentive structure for the minority, the vast majority of the time, as Senator Merkley earlier said, is just to say no. So what we are looking to do is create a set of rules that restore the incentives on both sides to figure out if there's common ground to be had. And so our Talking Filibuster proposal and some of the other rules that we would try to implement are intended to just bring back what used to exist in the Senate by code, which is this idea that everybody should have a chance to have a say, have a chance to offer amendments, and then we should vote and see whose views prevail, and then pass a bill. And that's, that is something that only works. The incentive structures have to ensure that both parties have a reason to talk to each other. And if there's a 60-vote threshold, but the minority party wins by saying no, then there's no reason ever to try to get to that 60-vote level.
Well, is there evidence, when you look at legislation that is passed without the filibuster, just a simple majority vote, when you look at reconciliation bills, do you see more compromise in those bills when that happens?
No, because the reconciliation bill is essentially, so the secret here, the dirtiest words in the US Senate are House of Representatives. Senators are terrified of, quote, turning the Senate into the House. And the reason is, in the House, the minority is a speed bump at best. The majority gets to decide if they have the votes and can all vote together, which in today's House of Representatives, is a rarity, but usually is the case. If they can hang together, they can do whatever they want, basically, legislatively. Reconciliation is essentially a variation on that theme imported into the Senate. It doesn't require the minority to have any voice in the process. So no, reconciliation does not create an incentive to compromise, which is why what we're talking about in the book as a solution set is not to just get rid of the filibuster entirely, which would produce more of a House-like dynamic, but instead to try to restore the way the Senate operated under the code, make sure that the minority does have a chance to offer amendments, to speak at length, leverage over the process, but not a veto, not an ability to obstruct endlessly.
Senator,
Sure that the minority, in order to block a bill or delay it, they have to continuously speak. Well, that's very hard work. So they have an incentive to compromise. Meanwhile, the majority can't afford for the Senate to be tied up for a week or two because there's so much that has to be done with other bills and nominations. So this creates an incentive for both sides to get to a deal.
One question I wanted to ask you, Senator, is you were talking about kind of your proposal earlier, just as Mike was now, and I want to take a step back and kind of dig in on how you envision the filibuster ought to look like, if you had your way. The talking filibuster, like you mentioned now, tell us a little bit more about the talking filibuster and why you think that's just the best way forward.
Yes, so let me go to January of 22, where we had the Freedom to Vote bill, and we were trying to get to a final conversation on the passage of the bill. So you get rid of the filibuster, the need for cloture motion, and the motion to proceed. You have a set of guaranteed amendments that are germane to the bill, so both sides get an opportunity to influence it. And then if you go to this period of final debate, you say no quorum calls, no motions to return the bill to committee. It's going to be continuous debate on the question of final passage. So now, in order to sustain debate, the minority, if they want more debate, has to actually be debating. And the majority is going to have to be there debating to help present their side of the vision. And as that proceeds, there's plenty of time to work out a compromise with both feeling the pressure to do so, as I mentioned, because of the burden on the minority of speaking and the majority's concern about the amount of time. On a modest bill, take, for example, an energy efficiency bill that Senator Portman, a Republican, and Senator Shaheen, a Democrat, had. It was a modest set of energy conservation measures, nothing that would light up the internet. And yet it was blocked 3 times because one person would object and have the votes to block it from proceeding. Well, in that case, the talking filibuster would proceed, and by 10 p.m., it would end because people wouldn't be going all night over this modest bill. They wouldn't be fundraising off it. They wouldn't be lighting up their base, and you'd get it passed. On the other hand, on a major bill like a voting rights bill or a PRO Act for labor rights or other bills that are really go to the heart of the differences between the two caucus that are deeply held issues related to the base, you might have a debate that goes on for night after night, day after day, but then the public's involved and you can eventually get to a vote because the original rules of the Senate and the current rules say that each senator can speak to an issue twice. And they may want to speak as long as they want, but eventually every senator who wanted to speak would use up their 2 speeches and you would get a final vote if a compromise hadn't been worked out before that moment.
Well, good thing that all your colleagues don't like to talk that much. So, one of the questions that I often think about, though, in seriousness, and I think a lot of people do, when it comes to filibuster reform, is that there might be value to a system where you do require more than a simple majority to pass legislation, because otherwise you kind of have a very unstable, volatile lawmaking system where you could pass these great reforms, one term, and then the next term they're gone, and then the public is left with one great social program, 1 year that they're going to rely on, and then all of a sudden it's the rug's pulled from under their feet. So there's kind of value in the stability of lawmaking there by making it a little bit harder. Maybe a supermajority or a 60-vote threshold is clearly too high. But what would you say to people who are kind of skeptical that the Senate ought to be just a simple majority? Let's just, give the majority kind of a carte blanche, do as you wish.
I would say to them that that type of flipping back and forth would require a change of a blue trifecta, a president, a House, and a Senate, to a red trifecta. And that even then, you might not see the change because there'd be members of the party in the House or Senate who didn't agree with the majority of their party. We know this from looking at state legislatures. We have 50 pilot projects, if you will, or 50 case studies, and we don't see wild swings from year to year, back and forth, flip-flopping, because it is a complicated system. You have to pass both the committee in the House and the full House, the committee in the Senate and the full Senate. The president has to weigh in and sign the bill. So given that in all three points, the House, Senate, and presidency would have to change. The rarity with which that happens, and the fact that that itself doesn't guarantee a whole different bill getting passed. And we saw this on Obamacare. When the Republicans were in charge and they'd held 50 votes in the House of Representatives to get rid of Obamacare, and they said we're determined to do it now, we've got a red trifecta, it didn't get changed because Senator McCain stepped in and said, you know what? I'm not tearing down this healthcare plan for millions of Americans. So it's really an argument that sounds a big concern, but in practice, it's not the way the system works.
So we're going to go to audience questions in a few minutes. So if you have any questions, start thinking of them now, and we'll pass around some microphones so you can all get a chance to ask Mike and the Senator some questions. But before we turn over, Senator, one more question for you is, as we were saying earlier, there is a good chance Republicans have a decent shot at regaining the Senate. They also have a decent shot at winning the presidency, and there's a good chance that they might consider filibuster reform. Not all of them are there yet. Some of them might be, some of them are not. If filibuster reform comes up and scrapping the filibuster as it is comes up when you're in the minority next year, would you support kind of scrapping the filibuster given the stakes of what the Republican agenda is right now?
I wouldn't support scrapping it, meaning getting rid of it, but I'd certainly support the talking filibuster. The test on whether you're presenting a fair proposal is, would you support it when you're in the minority as well as the majority? And absolutely, this would be an important reform. And if we can adopt it when the Republicans are in charge, I'm all for that. It'll make the Senate work a whole lot better for the American people.
Mike, one last question for you. Really, if you have like a closing pitch for any skeptic out there for why this should happen right now, especially given how polarized we are, what would that be?
It would basically be that when we systematically deny the ability of elected representatives to do the things they are elected to do, we break faith with the American people. And we are in a very perilous place as a country because American people do no longer believe that, or a big swath of them anyway, that democracy is working for them, that their elected officials are going to do the things that the voters want them to do. We were formed, the Constitution was written way back in 1787 in order to invest power in the people. Like, the people's preferences are supposed to decide how our country is governed. And when we have a systematic veto by the minority party, the party that the people rejected, and they get to set the agenda, democracy is failing. And that has really severe and real world implications. This isn't a political science exercise. This is about whether we are going to maintain a system of government by for the people, or whether we're going to succumb over time to the challenges that we've seen in lots of other places, where the appeal of broken norms and ability to actually deliver the things people want by any means necessary, and shattering the rule of law on the way, is that's the alternative that we're looking at over the long term. So we have to give voters the chance to shape our government. That's what we're supposed to. That's what democracy is about. That's what this institution is about. That's what Senator Kennedy was about. So I think that's the pitch.
Great. Well, I think we're going to turn it over to some audience questions now, because I think everybody's had enough of my questions now. So the first question actually is coming to us from a virtual attendee, former Senator Barbara Boxer. And her question is actually similar to something that I was just asking, but a little more pointed. if Republicans take control of the Senate next year, how long do you think until they do away with the filibuster full throttle?
Well, I don't think they'll do away with by the way, I've had the filibuster conversation with Barbara Boxer many times. We talked particularly about how it might affect legislation over reproductive rights. It was a pleasure to serve on the Environment Committee when she was in charge of it, and we miss her. So thank you, Barbara, for jumping in to participate. But the Republicans will not get rid of the filibuster because of the reasons that I laid out. And in 1996, there had been in place for 22 years a process that was filibuster free for one purpose, reducing the deficit. And the Republicans pulled a nuclear option, had a ruling by the parliamentarian who had worked for the Republican leader, Robert Dole, and ruled that this wasn't just for reducing the deficit, it could also be done to increase the deficit through tax cuts. And that change in interpretation gave them enormous powers to implement their agenda that doesn't exist for the policies that are presented by the Democrats in the Senate on healthcare, housing, education, and so forth. So they love the system as it is now, and they're going to leave it in place because it works really well for the powerful. Unfortunately, it works really badly for the people.
Mike, do you agree with the senator? We can mute you so he can't hear you if that's helpful.
Yeah, I generally agree with the senator. I do think there's a caveat that just as Donald Trump in 2017, 2018 didn't necessarily appreciate what a good thing he had, I think that there are some of a newer crop of sort of MAGA-y senators who are probably in the same boat. And we've seen in the House of Representatives over the last 2 years what happens when the tail wags the dog, and in the Republican Party. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they would do it. I think many of them might come to regret it, but I do think that the basic dynamics the senator is describing are absolutely right. They've got a good thing going where, when the filibuster exists, it was created and has always existed to serve the interests of the powerful, the kind of powerful minority, to hold on to power, economic power, political power, social power, and to prevent it from being dispersed. And that's the role it still plays today, and I think that a lot of Republicans like it that way.
All right, let's turn to some questions in the room. I believe Pam and Julia have some microphones to pass around. Any questions? Raise your hand if you have a question. Over there in the back.
Hi. No, I appreciate the idea to look at filibuster reform. I'm with the idea that talking, walk the walk. You're passionate about the bill, fight it. My question is, with these proposals, would it just be through the Senate Rules Committee voting? How would the whole process play out if you wanted to get any of these through?
So just to repeat the question for the senator so he can hear me, or hear the question, sorry. Do you want to repeat it? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is basically, how do you actually get the rules through? What's the process for changing the rules in the Senate? That's the basic gist of it. I'll take a first crack, Senator, and then I'll let you jump in. So the Senate rules provide for how the rules get changed, and the big innovation of the Southern senators in 1891, when they really turned the filibuster into the modern tool of, as the Jim Crow relic it became, is that you not only can filibuster a bill, you can filibuster a rule change to stop the filibustering. And that was what the Southern senators did every time this came up, from 1891 through the Civil Rights Movement into the 70s. That reality means that the Senate has had to find other ways to address obstruction and to sort of rebalance when obstruction gets out of control. And there's a whole host of bits of that story. One key piece is that in 1917, the Senate created what we call the cloture rule, which is the rule that is now used essentially as the floor, the 60 votes today, is because the Senate was like, filibustering's out of control, we need a way to end it. And so they created an exceptional tool, the supermajority cloture rule, as a way of stopping a filibuster. Prior to that, there was no way at all, there was no vote. So that was passed through a rule change that was not filibustered. But to change the rules today, practically speaking, we'd have to use something that is now generally referred to as the nuclear option. And it just basically means the Senate would vote to reinterpret its own rules, the existing rules. The Senate itself, all of you sitting in the senator's seats, you would be the deciding body of what the Senate rules mean. And so if a senator says, excuse me, I think that the rules mean that when it says 3/5 are required to invoke cloture on a nomination, that actually means a simple majority. Then if the Senate says, yes, we agree, that's the new rule. And so this has become the de facto way of changing the rules of the Senate in any time anything is at all contentious, because that process cannot be filibustered. Senator, do you want to elaborate or explain what I just tried to say?
Well, I'll just add this piece, and that is, people think of Robert Byrd as the defender of the filibuster, but he had a very interesting situation in 1977 when he became majority leader. And so the Republicans kept putting up different forms of obstruction, and Robert Byrd would respond by making a point of order, and he'd say, but doesn't the rule mean we should really act this way and not allow what the Republicans are doing? And then he would get a ruling from the chair, and either the ruling would be in his favor or he would get 50 plus votes to overturn the ruling of the chair. So he really invented this idea of reinterpreting rules. And he was creating a balance between him as the champion of the filibuster. He was a Southern Democrat who used it to block civil rights, and the leader who had to make the Senate function. So he continuously reinterpreted rules when there was absurd obstruction. And that's one of the things that that people are surprised to find out, that it was Robert Byrd who wrote the template for how to take on obstruction and keep the Senate functioning. And his last act was an article before he died in which he said, what you're all doing in this form of obstruction is completely outrageous. It's not a principled stand on a core issue. It is a paralysis of the Senate that does deep damage to democracy.
Rules and laws are only what we think they are, so interpretation matters. I think we have time for one more question, is that right? And then over there in the back. And I'll take notes this time, so I'll remember it.
Thank you. I am a historian, and a brief prefatory note. Charles G. Dawes was Vice President of the United States, the great-grandson of the great William Dawes, who rode successfully instead of Revere. And on March 4th of 1925, immediately after his election and inauguration as President of the Senate, as Vice President, he gave a ringing and controversial speech against the filibuster as being anti-democratic, worth looking up that far back. The other thing is the ERA effectively has been stopped because the Senate at 52 votes didn't get to 60. Is there possibly some way at some point where we might make a distinction that 60 votes in theory would be useful on statutes, but perhaps a simple majority vote on constitutional amendments?
So the question is whether we can rethink the threshold, whether 60 as a supermajority is the threshold for, you know, you got to be kidding me, I'm forgetting all this now. For constitutional amendments to have a supermajority versus regular votes, how can we rethink a supermajority there?
So in the height of our negotiations with Joe Manchin in 2021, leading up to the try to get the Freedom to Vote Act passed and the filibuster rule change, Angus King from Maine had a line that I just loved, which was, the founders knew fractions. And his point was, they put in the Constitution that you need, you know, 2/3 for treaties and impeachment, convictions, and a handful of other things. And they intentionally did not say you need a supermajority to pass bills. However, they did say you need a supermajority to pass constitutional amendments. So I do think that if we were going to try to address the constitutional amendment question, that itself would require a constitutional amendment. And that's that is hardwired into the Constitution. So there's nothing Senate rules can do to change that. It is interesting, though, sometimes that you might need to get a cloture vote of at least 60 to get to the 67 vote constitutional amendment vote, which presumably if you have the votes to pass the amendment, you've got the 60 to get cloture, but it is just a sign of the arcane nature of Senate rules.
We have time for one more? All right.
I'm sitting at Teddy Kennedy's desk, so I really don't need a microphone.
You need one for the people on the live stream.
Am I loud enough?
No, you need the live stream needs to be able to hear you.
I'm not as loud as Teddy?
No.
Senator, I'm sorry that you didn't make it here today. Have you been to UMass Boston ever?
Senator, have you been to UMass Boston ever?
I'm sorry,
Have you ever been to UMass Boston is the question.
no, I haven't. Is it an invitation? I'm on my way.
I didn't have a question as much as an admonition that Mussolini got the trains to run on time. So if we're not able to really become the Senate that passes laws, then we may be in danger of having something done.
Thank you, sir. For those in the audience, the statement there was that Mussolini got the trains to run on time, and if the Senate can't figure out how to get its legislation passed, we're going to be in trouble. So, is that all the time we have for tonight? Great. Well, Senator Merkley, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your time. Mike, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for this great book. I hope people pick up a copy. And I believe we have some closing remarks from Adam. And thanks to the Ted Kennedy Institute so much for hosting this event. It's an important conversation. I hope we keep having it. So thank you all for coming.
Said, and let's work together to make our institutions hum along and address the real issues, so we will have government of, by, and for the people, not for the powerful.
Thank you.
You're getting a round of applause.
I've repositioned myself, Senator, so that I can say thank you to you. We really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you for doing your job and taking the tough votes tonight, because I understand they're ongoing, and so we appreciate your attention to this important conversation and for doing it here at the Institute, and same to you, Mike, as well, and thank you, Abdullah, for a wonderful round of questions. We really do appreciate it. Stay seated for a bit longer. We're going to have Mike go out, and as you know, we'll have a chance to have your questions with him out there and sign the books that are available. But we do want you to join us for the reception outside as well. And we have a number of events coming up in the spring and summer, so please go to our website, emkinstitute.org, to sign up for those and stay informed. And we look forward to having you back soon. So thanks again. Have a good night, everyone.